Hi, and welcome back to the Learning Series. It is another beautiful Thursday in the state of North Dakota. Today, we are going to be talking a little bit about getting and staying organized as a district auditor. This is a topic that comes up and we get questions, so we want to just give you a few little details on this, and hopefully you can get something valuable out of today's presentation. Just a note before we get started. So if you have questions at any time during this presentation, feel free to go up. I think it's in the far right corner next to the leave button. Don't hit the leave button. So if you're going to ask a question, just click the Q&A button and then you can post it. And then I will get to those questions at the end. For today's presentation, I'm going to try and keep it a little bit shorter. I'm hoping for anywhere from 35 to 40 minutes. So if you do have any questions, we'll have lots of time at the end for those. So with that, I think we'll get started right into today's content. Just need to share my screen here. Okay. So I hope everyone can see that. Let's see. All right, looks like everyone can see that now. So yeah, today, I might have forgot to mention this. My name is Pearl Corsier. I'm the Training and Education Coordinator here at the North Dakota State Auditor's Office. I do work within the Office of Good Government, so we provide training materials and free consultations for people working for small local political subdivisions. So that's anyone with, revenues under 2 million. And so we provide help with filling out that annual financial report form and things like that. So yeah, without further ado, we'll get into the content. So as the role of a district auditor, and I use the terminology auditor here, but really that can apply to, you could be a secretary, a clerk, the business manager. That's just the terminology we're using here. That's what we call the bookkeepers in the cities. They're called city auditors. So you'll hear me using that word. That might not be your title, but don't worry, it still applies to you. So yeah, but as you're kind of the watchdog for your entity's funds, you ensure that you have financial oversight and accountability, and that's what we're here. We're trying to make sure that you're doing the job that you're supposed to be doing, and then that translates into good reporting, and it ensures that there's public trust with your citizens because the job that you have is very important, right? These are taxpayer dollars that are being spent, and people want to know that their money is being spent appropriately. So part of your job is ensuring that financial records are accurate, complete, and compliant. You're there to identify any inefficiencies, waste, fraud, or mismanagement of public funds. You're really the first line of defense if there's anything potentially nefarious going on within your district. And then another piece of that is transparency. You share those financial records reports, and you also share any sort of those reports at your board meetings, council meetings, what have you. And that helps your members, your board members, council members make informed decisions because they have accurate financial data and they're not just making decisions, just based off what they feel that day. And then finally down there, the piece about compliance. You ensure that city operations, sorry, not city, it can be any district, but operations, finances, and records adhere to state law, federal law, and accounting standards. And there's a lot in that. And, if you're ever overwhelmed by the different types of compliance pieces, always feel free to contact us. We're always available for questions and such like that. So moving into it, a big piece of this is managing your records. So you have a lot of records. I mean, there's like budget records, there are receipts, invoices, pretty much anything that gets documented, you need to save. So a big part of it is managing those and making sure that they're available. And it's going to help you, it's going to help during the audit process. But, for audit readiness, if you're getting an audit, or let's say you have an annual financial review coming up, and you need to gather a bunch of files, you can go in and gather whatever you need. It just ensures that accurate, organized financial records for audits. And I want to make a point that this is also a time-saving thing, and it's also a money-saving because the less time it takes you to get records to your auditor, the less time it's going to take on your audit, meaning the more money you're going to save during your audit. And then regulatory compliance, there are legal and governmental reporting requirements, and They're also required, like you think need to save things for regulatory compliance. So it also helps you keep in line with that. And then financial accuracy, an example would be bank reconciliations. You're making sure that your fund balance is agreeing to what you have in your bank, and just balancing between those two. But it'll help you prevent errors, fraud, and any sort of mismanagement of public funds. And then, moving into efficient decision making, it's going to provide that reliable data for your board or council, for budgeting and for financial planning. Let's say you have a big project coming up in the future that you need to save money for. It can help with that as well. And then finally, this big piece, but it's not the last piece, but I think it's probably one of the most important pieces, is public trust. It just demonstrates that responsible financial stewardship. It's not our money, it's the public, it's the public's money, and we're just making decisions with it, right? So you want to be presenting it in a way that it shows that the money is all there, it's being used appropriately, just to avoid, any sort of mistrust in that area. So moving into this record keeping thing. So typically we'll see like filing systems. So if you don't have a filing system for your district, we highly recommend making one. It's going to help you stay organized. And it's just going to make things a lot easier on you as the bookkeeper, auditor, um, clerk, what have you. But typically you'll see that the filing system is going to have main categories. So, you'd have these are all just examples over here, right? I mean, you set it up how it makes sense to you, but would also make sense to other people if they were to come in your district. We see a lot of turnover in these types of positions because they can be difficult, depending on your situation, what have you. But, set it up in a way that makes sense to you and to other people, so that if someone came in and needed to take over, they could come in and recognize and figure out what exactly is going on. But just example, financial reports could be your annual financial reports, your audits, a budget, like a main category would include your approved budgets, amendments, projections, your preliminary budgets. Accounts payable would be all your invoices, vendor contracts, payment records, and then accounts receivable, tax receipts, fees, fines, grants, and so on down the list. But just helping getting those main categories, you're going to have subcategories within that, because again, you have so many records to keep track of. But starting with a good main filtering category is going to help keep all of those, help you keep track of those. So moving into the subcategories, again, these are just examples. You set it up how it would make sense to you and hopefully make sense to other people coming in. But yeah, each main category folder should have subfolders, categories by year, department, or project. They're going to be set up a little bit differently depending on, depending on what you have going on. But, over here on the left, I do like the system of setting it up per year. That way you keep track of it as one whole year. Because let's say for an annual financial review, if you're filling that out, you would take all of the information and data from that year. Or if you have you're getting an audit and you have auditors that are requesting documents, you can go right to the years that they're working on, get that information and pass that on pretty quickly. The only one where it's different is that for payroll and employee records, you typically have employees as the first main category, and then probably years within that. That's because you typically have employees for typically many years, depending. Let's see. So then I want to move on. So depending on the size of your district or your entity, in North Dakota, we have cities that have, millions and millions of dollars that they work with. And then we also have very small districts as well. So depending on what it looks like, you have to, find the best record keeping system for your district. But that's going to vary depending on the size of your district. So, I mean, digital record keeping systems are typically, I think most districts are moving towards those because they're typically just easier to use. But within those, you have centralized storage. You can put all of your information in one place, and you don't have to, it's kept on your computer. You don't have to go, rifling through a bunch of files to find what you need. So it does make it a little bit easier. And then there are also, typically search functions. So you can instantly retrieve those records, generate reports. Again, this would be really helpful during an audit or an annual financial review, depending on what you have going on. Another great piece of having digital record keeping systems are backups to protect against data loss, if they're not subject to any sort of like physical elements. Um, but typically you have backups. So let's say you were to lose your computer or something like that. Hopefully you would have a way to get into that. And usually there is a way to get into your records without needing that physical computer to get into it. And another big piece is cost savings, reduced paper costs. That's paper costs money, right? I mean, everything costs money for the most part, but you're typically not going to have those paper costs. You might have some costs with maybe having a keeping system or data storage. You can have some cost there, but you will have paper costs, and also you won't have to have the filing systems to keep track of all of it as well. Then moving on to, physical record keeping systems. So the smaller districts typically we see this, and there are a lot of people who still use physical record keeping systems, and there's nothing wrong with it. It just you have kind of have to get strategic with how you do it, but you're going to need to have a lot of filing cabinets and shelving. But it needs to be in a secure place because some of these documents are sensitive and shouldn't be seen by everyone's eyes, so they need to be locked up. That's one thing to keep in mind if you do have a physical record keeping system, is to keep them locked up. But you would need to have secure storage for payroll, invoices, payroll, budgets, and reports. Within that, you'd have labeled folders and dividers, categorized by year, department, or document type, just for easy retrieval. Again, if you have an audit going on or you're gathering documents for a board meeting or a council meeting that you need to bring. But to keep track of it, you would have an indexing system. So, the opposite for that, for the digital record keeping system is that search function, but this would be an indexing system, would be your way to keep track of it on a physical record keeping system. And then the other part of this, the upsides are really you don't have any software costs. So it is a little bit cheaper. They're physical documents, so you're immune to any cybersecurity risks. In the digital age that we are in, there's a lot of risks with phishing, malware and that sort of thing. So it's easier, I think, for things to get hacked nowadays. So if you do have a physical record keeping system, it's going to be immune to that. And the other thing is that if you do have non-digital users, very accessible for people who don't like computers and that sort of thing as well. So moving on with that, document retention. So every document that you have is going to have, most of them they're going to have a document retention policy. So in your district, you'll want to clearly define those document retention periods, and you can figure those out. You can go to the state's attorney, and I do know that NDIT also they have a list of how long documents should be kept. So you can always go out to their website and check it out too, to see how long you need to keep things, because the reality is that when you have these records, most of them are public records. So if you're keeping them beyond their needed document retention period, you could have years and years of records that when someone makes a record request saying, I want all of these types of records, it's still considered an open record because it hasn't been destroyed yet. So they could still request them, and that could add on to a lot of work for you. And we want to avoid that because we know that most of you, this is probably a part-time position, so you want to maximize your time and be as efficient as possible. And then moving down to retaining audit records. So approved audit year documents should be kept until the next year's audit has been approved. So an example of this would be if you had your 2023 audit or annual financial review completed, you would want to wait until 2025 has been approved, just because in case there are any changes that needed to be made in 2024, you'd want to keep that until the subsequent year has been approved. And develop procedure for records disposal. So again, that's tying into that document retention period. So once you have that in place, then you can clearly develop a plan to dispose those records, and that's going to save you a lot of time, money, and space. You won't have to, again, that saving time piece is if someone has a record request and they go in and they request a bunch of records, you don't have to pull all of those and find them. And that also saves you money. And it also is going to save you space, whether that's digital or physical space for records disposal. So moving into reporting, standardizing report templates. So you want to present when you're presenting at your board meeting, council meeting, the current the current docket, like what the how it's sitting financially. You want consistent reporting templates. So same structure, terminology, formatting. It's going to provide transparency to citizens at those meetings and show accurate financial data. And it's going to eliminate a lot of the redundant formatting tasks, saving you more time. And then it's going to allow for faster comparisons of financial performance if you give your board or council similar documents to look at. And examples of these would be a profit and loss statement. That's pretty standard. Bank reconciliations, that could save a lot of time. Bank reconciliations should be done on a monthly basis at month end. So if you have a standardized report template for that, it's going to simplify things a lot. And then expense and payroll summaries, your grant and funding reports, and accounts payable and receivable reports. Not every district might have those. I know some of the districts are strictly on a cash basis, so they wouldn't have those. And then automating data analysis. So I know it sounds like a lot. So this would be maybe for districts that have a lot more money, or maybe have an in-depth accounting system, but automating your data collection analysis, like your bank reconciliations, your payroll processes. I know that some payroll systems are separate and some aren't, but I know that you can tie in your payroll system into your accounting system, which can really streamline your payroll processes. And then visualizing revenues and expenses, using bar charts, graphs, that sort of thing for when you're going to your meetings and you need to present that financial data. And also processing invoices. I think that you can actually enter, I've heard and I've seen that you can enter into your accounting system your invoices. I think you can take pictures. Yeah, that's down there, the capturing receipts. So you can take pictures of your receipts, which will automatically upload that into your accounting system. So then you have that receipt or that invoice with that expense. Because your invoices and your expense, they should be together, so that if you pull those, let's say your auditor came in and said, well, we're going to test this amount of um, these expenses, then you could pull those, you would see it, and then you would have, if you paid it with a check, you would have that invoice right there. So you'd have that supporting documentation right there with it. Oops. Let's see. Okay, and then I want to move into reporting. I just want to talk a little bit about the fund types. So in governmental accounting, we typically have um, we have about 6 different funds. So everyone has a general fund. You're going to have, that's just your operating fund. That's kind of like anything can be paid out of there, provided that it's legal per North Dakota Century Code. But that's where everything, anything can go in there, anything can come out of that general fund. And then your special revenue fund, that's usually restricted by either North Dakota Century Code, federal, or if board action or council took action to set aside funds as a special revenue. But those are restricted. They're only allowable per those, whatever restrictions they are. And you will typically know if you have a special revenue fund. There are a few that do come from the state treasurer's office. The cities commonly get are the highway tax dollars, and then also the legacy funds. Those are examples of special revenue funds. And then your debt service fund. So this prior to this last spring, so we just changed our annual financial review process. And for the small governments out there, I think the communication was that these debt service funds, it was if it took longer than a year to pay off, and that's actually not accurate. So you only need a debt service fund if there's some sort of legal documentation requiring it. And typically you're going to see that with bonds. Those are typically going to have that debt service fund requirement with it. But other than that, you will typically know if you need to have one. And then the other one is a capital project fund. Those are for your really big funds. I mean, if you're going to be spending, over $250,000 to build something, and you're going to have the bidding to go with it, the expenses and all that stuff. You'd want to have a capital project fund for that. Or let's say if you wanted to save up, you have a project coming up in the future, you could create a capital project fund to move money into that each year to save up for that project. And then your enterprise funds are your business type funds. Most commonly, you're going to see these with cities, and that's your, water, sewer, garbage. And enterprise just refers to the business type funds. We don't see a lot of these with other districts. It's mainly just with cities, just given the function of the other types of districts. And then that bottom one, the custodial funds, those are just pass-through funds. So again, commonly you're going to see these in cities. So there is state aid that cities get, and a portion of that goes, I think it's a percentage amount that goes to park districts. So whatever goes into the custodial fund must come out at year end. So that's always a zero balance at year end for the custodial funds. But as far as reporting and, staying organized with these, it's always going to be much easier if you limit the number of funds that you have. It means there are fewer things to reconcile. You don't have to reconcile as many funds at, month end. It's just going to simplify things for you if you have fewer funds. So we like to encourage and recommend that you really only have the funds that are legally necessary or required per accounting standards. And if you do have questions about that, you can always ask our office. Like maybe you came into a position where the district auditor had a bunch of different funds, and you're like, I'm not really sure why these were created. I don't know. And you want to kind of clean things up, feel free to contact us. We're more than happy to help with that, and tell you and give you advice on that. So then this is just a visual piece here, but you can see over on the left there, you could only have one general fund. You can't have multiple general funds. And then I use that special revenue, so highway fund. That library fund would be like a North Dakota Century Code special levy fund. And debt service, the sewer repayment, that would be like a legally required document. And bonded debt, that would be a bond agreement where you have to have that debt service fund. And then capital project, an example would be like a big street project, maybe the municipal infrastructure funds. So I think they're referred to as the prairie dog funds. Those per North Dakota Century Code do have to go into a capital project fund. And then over there, the enterprise funds, the water and sewer, garbage, what have you. And the custodial would be passed through to park. If you are levying on behalf of the park district, you'd pass those funds down onto the park district. Excuse me. Okay, so I guess I got a little bit ahead of myself there. I do have a slide on this, but reporting and limiting the number of funds. But funds do complicate that reporting. It can impact your accounting systems and reconciling them at year end, and your bank reconciliations can complicate that. Another thing it does complicate is our budgets. And as you all are definitely well aware, this year came with a very complicated and challenging budgeting season. So especially now, having those extra funds is really going to complicate those budgets for you guys. But again, another thing is if you're ever worried about maybe you need to have a special fund for something, you can always have a board member look at it, get another set of eyes on it. Contact your state's attorney and ask if they would know, have them read through a bond agreement, or, if you get a loan, hey, does this need to have a debt service fund to go with it for repayment and that sort of thing. So reach out, use the resources you have. You don't have to do it alone. And if you ever need to, you can always contact our office. And if we can't help you, we'll get you in contact with someone who can. Okay. So switching gears, we're going to move on into internal controls here. So internal controls are a big thing. It is difficult in the state of North Dakota because we have, I can't remember what the statistic is. I think it's something like two people per square mile. I can't remember exactly what it is, or if it's even that. But it's hard to get it's hard to get internal controls, because usually a segregation of duties, that means that you split up the financial duties by person, but usually within your district, you're the one and only person doing it. But luckily, there are ways that you can kind of implement these things. So, um, like, for an example, would be at your board meetings, bringing a list of all of the invoices that you have to pay and getting an approval for all of those at your board meetings. So, example, if you were at your next audit or at your annual financial review and someone asks, well, do you have approval of these? Like, you can bring back the meeting minutes to say, yeah, here was the list. They're documented in the meeting minutes. I got approval at the board for these. And that's one way to segregate those duties. And then, yeah, approval by board, and then record that payment approval in the meeting minutes. So you bring them to the board, they'd approve, record it in the meeting minutes. That way you have a record of it. And then authorization. So your counselor board would approve of contracts. This would be if if you're bidding out a project or something like that. And I do want to mention here, so since there are a lot of small towns, there are always concerns. A lot of people have businesses, like contracting businesses, and maybe they're contracting for the city. So if there is a city council member that maybe they are a part of that business, they should recuse themselves from voting on that project. But if they do win that project, or when they win that bid, they get that contract, then there should be sufficient documentation that the city is aware of this, that this could be a conflict of interest. The city has approved it. It's okay. You just want to make sure you follow those right procedures and steps so that you are covered when it comes to that time. When it comes to that time, if it were to be questioned by someone. And then accessing controls, limit access to those financial systems so that not anyone can get in there and, mess with numbers and things like that. Your bank accounts, not everyone should have access to those. And your sensitive records, like your payroll records, you don't want those available for anyone to go and look at because they do carry sensitive information. So financial controls, this can look like a lot of different things, but I have a few different things here would be implementing secure cash handling and deposit protocols, just so that if you do, let's say you're a city and you get cash, people come in and pay with cash for their water bills, their utility bills, just that you have something to record that. So when they bring it in, you have a cash receipting book so that you have another record of it. And then, that deposit protocol. So nothing would go missing, in between there. And then bank reconciliations. You want to reconcile your bank statements to your ledger records monthly. That's going to help a lot of things. It could, you can catch those mistakes because it might not even be you making a mistake. It could be the bank. Believe it or not, we actually see quite a few bank errors. So there could be stuff happening on the bank side that you're not seeing, but doing that monthly bank reconciliation will just help you make sure that you have both of those tied out to each other and that they're balancing. And it'll just avoid further headaches in the future when it comes down to your audit and people ask, well, why is this off? And then at least you can go back to your bank reconciliation and say, this is what I have here, here, and here. And then invoice verification, so ensuring that all your revenues, your taxes, fees, or grants are properly recorded in your system. So just make sure you have the verification behind it as well. So moving on to procurement controls, so competitive bidding processes. Again, this can be difficult if you live in a small town, but there is a requirement for multiple bids for contracts to make sure that you're picking the most fiscally responsible bid. So, you look at fair pricing, preventing favoritism so that not one contractor is getting every single bid. And then the board is to approve of the bid. So, you bring those, you shouldn't be making that decision as, the auditor or clerk or anything like that to approve those. So you'd want to bring that to your board, have them review them, and then document the process that they went through to pick that, and then document that in your meeting minutes. And then here I mentioned again, so the conflict of interest, board members should recuse themselves from voting on any items that may affect them. Again, that's an example of, a city council member being related to someone who owns the business, or, they profit somehow from that business. They should recuse themselves from voting on it. You can still, use those companies, but you just have to be careful with how you go about it. And then payroll controls. So whenever I give this presentation in person, I do like to ask who uses a system who uses a paper system or if they have a digital payroll system. It's always a fun question to ask just to see where people are at with it. But we do highly recommend using in a digital system, at least to just track the times, right? Because it's so easy to, I mean, not so, maybe not so easy, but it is easier to falsify records if it is on paper. But time tracking, utilize electronic systems to prevent that any sort of payroll fraud, um, not representing the numbers accurately or anything like that. But payroll reconciliation, verify that your salary payments are aligning with your employee records and approved pay rates. So every city employee or, whatever district employee should have approved pay rates, and there should be documentation and records kept for that. And then at the end, just reviewing reports, compare reports to previous periods for any sort of discrepancies. That can help you catch anything early on before it could snowball out of control, and then you have a real problem on your hands. Going into budget preparation, so, I mean, this might be a little bit late for this because I think you guys had to have your budget submitted already. But use the budget template from our website to create your budget. I do know that the Association of Counties now has their 3% tax cap budget form, and I think that's just an additional. So you still need your original budget form, but you would need that as well. But while you're going through this process, obtain budget needs from different departments, gather your financial data, review prior year budgets, expenses, revenue trends, forecast for any potential inflation, the economic conditions and policy changes. The economic conditions have been pretty crazy lately. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to those and accounting for those appropriately. But set goals and priorities, identifying those departmental needs. If you're in a bigger city, don't just try to make up the numbers or figure it out on your own or just go off of last year. Reach out to them, figure out what their needs are so you can appropriately budget for that. And plans for projects and sustainability. This isn't just a 1 year, 2 year thing. It's a 5 year, 10 year down the road. You want to be well set up for the future. So, and then tracking and variance. So compare your actual numbers to your budget numbers. Any overspending will require a budget amendment. Attain that amendment approval at the council or board meetings, and then communicate those changes. Make sure that that is make sure that those budget amendments are documented in your meeting minutes so you have a record of that. And comment, like, variance can happen all the time. You could have emergency repairs. Who doesn't have emergency repairs? They happen all the time. Especially now with tax fluctuation, it's going to change a lot with that 3% tax cap. And then grant funding delays. Let's say you didn't get you didn't get forms filled out in time or something like that, but you were expecting to have this grant in this year, but you're not gonna be able to get it until next year. That could be one reason why your budget changed. And then economic downturns. Again, we're kind of in a volatile economic environment right now, so that's a good thing to keep in mind as well, that can affect your budget variance. And then I want to just briefly talk about a strategic plan. So this can be really helpful for planning for the future with your district or city. So create a 3 to 5 year strategic plan. There are tools out there and a lot of tools for creating strategic plans, but it should be a multi-year forecast, anticipating your future budget needs, any projects that you might need to be completed, like ones that are maybe higher priority and lower priority, and seeing where you can fit them in for the next coming years. And then grants as well. um, Grant funding is you never know if maybe you get it for 2 years, but you're not always going to have it, right? So that can just kind of fluctuate up and down as time goes on. Conduct reviews of the strategic plan, update it as needed. Things are constantly changing, budgets are changing, but update the strategic plan as needed. I do believe that the Department of Commerce actually does offer help with strategic plans if that's something that maybe your district would be interested in creating. Okay, so moving into detecting and preventing any sort of mismanagement. An option is you could establish a finance committee if you have, and that could be some board members that are a part of the finance committee, and then have your bank reconciliations reviewed by other people. So don't just review it yourself. I know whenever I do something and I review it and I say, did I really do that? or maybe it's something I've completed a year before. I go back and I look at it and I'm like, who did that? But we make mistakes. It's very easy to make mistakes. So having a have a second set of eyes look at it can always be really helpful. Examine expenses for any irregularities. If you have anything that's fluctuating up and down, that might be a cause for concern to just investigate it a little bit further. Check for any conflict of interest in vendor payments. Maybe, you have a city council member that, owns the local hardware store. Maybe you need to look into those and check those, right? Um, I'm not saying that anything could be happening. It's just you want to make sure that things aren't happening. And then approve payments at council meetings. I know I remember that I mentioned this earlier, but you do want to have your board prove that and have documentation of that. And then try to separate duties as much as you possibly can. Really, no employee should have full control over financial transactions. If you're ever curious, actually, a good example of something like this happening, an employee having full control over financial transactions, was Dixon. Is it Dixon? I think it was Dixon, Illinois. There was a huge embezzlement case that happened there. But if you're ever interested, that's fascinating to go look at. But basically the city comptroller there had full control over financial transactions and was able to embezzle a bunch of money during that. But if there's anything potential that you're seeing, um, contact our office and the state bonding fund, because if you have coverage through the state bonding fund, you have, I believe it's 90 days. It's either 60 or 90 days. Don't quote me on that. We'd have to go check. But you have a certain amount of time to go look at it and see how much time you have to submit that bonding fund claim. So moving on to any tools for organization productivity. So if you have digital systems, those are great. That's a great way to streamline your workflow and enhance your productivity. But utilize your digital systems to upload invoices so you don't have to find the check stub, put it with the check, and put it in the same place. But streamline pulling invoices for payment approval at council meetings, their board meetings. You're going to save a lot of time pulling records by streamlining those processes. And again, set up report templates so that each month you have the same reports that you're bringing to your board meetings, council meetings. And use the report templates that they're simple to read, right? You don't want something that's super complicated that makes it difficult for them to understand and, realize what's going on with it. But providing your board members with accurate financial data just helps them make better informed decisions with taxpayer money. And then moving on to task management. So utilize checklists. You have a month-end close checklist that includes, any reconciliation, maybe reporting tasks. Review the tasks that maybe didn't get completed that need to be completed within the next month. A budget prep checklist, that'll track your key steps for in that financial planning process. I know that kind of probably would have gotten turned upside down this year with the 3% tax caps, but just got to prepare as best you can. And then accounts payable, receivable workflow. If you are a bigger district, that is tracking those, and just ensure that those invoices and payments are processed correctly through that. And then just moving into more of these, so cash handling procedures, those that just would outline how to securely receive, record, and deposit those funds that you might receive. And then any invoice approvals, that would define steps from invoice receipt to that payment approval. And then a payroll processing guide, just that would include accurate payroll calculations and reporting. You don't want the IRS to come back and have issues with that. That could create a lot of problems. And then grant fund tracking process. That would just specify how to manage grant expenditures and reporting. That could differ from grant to grant as well. And this is just kind of a fun little thing. So data visualization. I'm a visual learner, so I like to see pictures and things like that. And I like to see it that way because that kind of just helps me understand things better. But example, like you use a bar chart or a line graph to look at compared budgeted versus your actual spending. So you could just compare those numbers really easily. These are super helpful to bring to your council meetings or board meetings to present how things are looking like, rather than just a bunch of numbers, on a spreadsheet or something like that. But over here on the right, we show a pie chart that just shows a breakdown of revenue sources. You could use trend lines to display any historical revenue growth or decline, and then outlier scatter plots. You could spot unusual transactions or any financial discrepancies with that as well. And then moving into kind of time management. So find a time management system that works for you and your district or city. It's going to depend person to person. Everyone works a little bit differently. I've seen the Eisenhower matrix, which kind of prioritizes by, how urgent it is, how important it is, and that sort of thing. But find something that works for you. Or I like to time block, which is I just set like maybe an hour of my day. For this hour, I'm just going to work on this and only this. And then I do use my calendar for automatic alerts so that if there are, recurring things that I need to complete at end of month, I get that reminder. And I'll even set a reminder a week before, hey, in a week you have this coming up, so I don't miss it. So just things like that can be helpful so you're not missing any important deadlines or anything like that. And then as far as communication, so you do want to be communicating that financial data out because we want to be transparent with the numbers and the funds. So use plain language in your report. So avoid technical jargon. It can be very confusing for people who don't understand. There's actually a website that is designated for just using plain language, and it's called plainlanguage.gov. And I recommend going out there. It just gives you helpful tips and tricks for writing and making things easier for people to understand because we're dealing with things that might be technical, but just putting it into terms that are easier for people to understand. Break down complex information. Utilize charts, visual charts that display numbers. Those are super helpful. Make sure that you're posting meeting minutes so that they're publicly available. So you can make meeting minutes available online. I know some smaller districts even utilize Facebook, and that's totally feasible. You can use Facebook to post your meeting minutes. I know some places that are posted in newspapers or things like that, but use what you have available. You don't have to spend a lot of money for a lot of these things most of the time. You can usually find something that'll work relatively well. And encourage citizen involvement, at your board meetings and your council meetings. Encourage, citizens to come so they can see the position of your district and how things are going and where money is being sent and the projects that are being worked on and that sort of thing as well. So I know we covered a lot today. And maybe you do have a really good system. Maybe you have a good system, but you want to go back and you want to revamp it to something that makes a little more sense to you or something like that. Or maybe you don't have a system and you're kind of panicking and this is a lot of information and you're wondering, where do you even start? I would recommend just starting with organizing your files and organizing the documents that you do have, because then once you get a system down, you can go and you can put the future documents and receipts and things like that, where to put it. Standardize your report templates. That's another great place to start. It's just having those standardized report templates. And then third is developing financial procedures, but just start small. Don't get overwhelmed. Start small. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us at any time. But yeah, here it is again. So if you have questions, contact our office. We'll work with your district to try and to help you get organized. And I do want to mention that next month we will have Alan Brinkman from State Surplus Property speaking about how local districts can take advantage of state surplus programs, and they can find cheaper things to purchase at a discounted rate through those programs. So please go, if you haven't already, please go out and sign up for Alan Brinkman's session next month. And that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm not seeing any questions yet. So if you do have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll go to the next slide here. Second. So if you have any questions, do email me anytime to ask those. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good day.